Unit 2, The Address by Marga Minko. This story is a poignant means sad account, of the daughter who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the war in Holland. When she finds them, the object evoke memories of her earlier life. When she finds the things that belong to her mother, that say has a nostalgic feeling, and she tries to remember the leave them all behind and resolve to move on. This is the background. The author goes in search of, the daughter goes in search of, say, her mother's belongings after the war. In the war, she had lost her belongings, and then after the war gets over, the mother is no more, and she goes in search of the things that belong to her mother because she had given it to somebody else. So she goes to that lady to whom she had given those things, and on seeing those objects, she remembers her early life, but at last she decides to move on from the past and leave all those things with the lady who had it, or who had been given those things by the mother. Do you still know me? I asked. The woman looked at me searchingly. This woman is the woman to whom the uh, mother had given the belongings. She had opened the door a chink a little. I came closer and stood on the step. No, I don't know you. I am Mrs. S.'s daughter. She held her hand on the door as though she wanted to prevent it opening any further. She was standing at the door in such a way that it seemed that she didn't want to open it more. Her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition. She kept staring at me in silence. Perhaps I was mistaken. I thought. Perhaps it isn't her. Means briefly, and that was years ago, so it's likely that it's somebody else. It was most probable means possible that I had rung the wrong bell. The women let go of the door and stepped on the side. She was wearing my mother's green knitted cardigan. Now, the cardigan that was knitted by her mother was worn by this lady. The wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. The wooden buttons that were there on that cardigan had become pale because it had been washed so many times. She saw that I was looking at the cardigan and half hid herself again behind the door. She realized that the daughter was looking at the cardigan and that belonged to her mother, and so she again hid behind the door. But I know now that I was right. Well, you knew my mother, I asked. Have you come back? Said the woman. I thought that no one had come back. So, after the war, how is it that you have come back? I thought that no one had come back. The doctor replies that only I have come, only me. A door opened and closed in the passage behind her. A musty smell emerged, and I regret I cannot do anything for you, the lady said. I have come here specially on the train. I wanted to talk to you for a moment. It's not convenient for me now, said the woman. I can't see you another time. At present, it is not convenient, and I don't want to meet you again. She nodded. The cautiously closed the door as though no one inside the house should be disturbed. It is not convenient for me now. I can't see you another time. I stood where I was on the step. The curtain in front of the bay window moved. Someone stared at me and would then have asked what I wanted. Oh, nothing, the woman would have said. It was nothing. So inside the conversation was going on that who is it and what does she want? So the woman inside, though the daughter could not listen to that, but said that nothing. I looked at the nameplate again. Darling, it said, in black letters on white enamel, and on the jam, a bit higher, the number 46. As I walked slowly back to the station, I thought about my mother, who had given me the address years ago. This was the address given to her by her mother. It had been in the first half of the war. I was home for a few days, and it struck me immediately that something or other about the rooms had changed. Before the war, in the early part of the in the first part of the war, say she had been given the address, and when she was home before the war, at that time, say she noticed in her own house when she lived with her mother that something or the other has changed. I missed various things in the room were missing. My mother was surprised I should have noticed so quickly. Naturally, the things in the room were missing, but the mother was still surprised that the daughter could notice that. Then she told me about Mrs. Dorling. I had never heard of her, but apparently she was an old acquaintance of my mother. She was known to my mother for long, whom she hadn't seen for years. She had suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. The mother had turned up to Mrs. Darling, who was her old acquaintance, and she had renewed the contact. Since then, she had come regularly. After that, say, Mrs. Darling used to come regularly to her house. Every time she leaves here, she takes something home with her. Every time she leaves here, means she leaves from the house, she would take something with her, said my mother. She took all the table silver in one go, and then the antique plates that hung there. She had trouble lugging those large vases, and I am worried she got a crick in her back from the crockery. Now, these are the things that she took one by one. In one go, she took all the table silver, crockery, and all that, and the antique plates. And maybe, say, while she was taking the large vases at that time, say, she had a crick in her back also. My mother shook her head pityingly. I would never have dared ask her. I did not have the courage to ask her. She suggested it to me herself. She herself told me that all these things that are valuable in your house, you cannot keep it here because the wartime is going on and it's likely that, say, everything will go away. She even insisted that let me take all these things. She wanted to save all my nice things, all the nice things that were there in the house. Mrs. Darling wanted to save them. If we have to leave here, we shall lose everything, she says. That is what the mother had replied to the daughter and had conveyed to her about why Mrs. Darling came there and why she took all the precious, valuable things. Because it is likely that they might have to leave from there, and in that case, they would lose everything. Have you agreed with her that have you made an agreement with her that she would not keep everything with her and she would return all those things? The daughter asked the mother. As if that's necessary, my mother cried. Is it necessary to make such an agreement? It would simply be an insult to talk like that. That will you give all these things back to me? To make such an agreement was a kind of insult. And think about the risk she is running. Each time she goes out with a full suitcase or bag, she is running a risk, the wartime risk that was there. My mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced with her giving away all these things without any agreement, and it was very much likely that Mrs. Darling would take away everything. In that case, also, they would be deprived of everything. She looked at me reprovingly, and after that, we spoke no more about it. Meanwhile, I had arrived at the station without having paid much attention to things on the way. In the meantime, say, while walking back, Mrs. Darling did not allow her in. She even denied that she did not know her or recognize her. and she did not entertain her in any way. So she was walking back to the station, and she did not pay much attention to anything at the station while on the way to the station. I was walking in the familiar places again for the first time since the war. After the war, she had come there for the first time and she was walking through the familiar places. But I did not want to go further than was necessary. She didn't want to take more interest or unnecessary interest in anything. I didn't want to upset myself with the sight of streets and houses full of memories from a precious time. The precious time that she had spent over there. She did not want to be disturbed by looking at the streets and the house in which she lived, or say the houses around. In the train back, I saw Mrs. Darling in front of me again as I had the first time I met her. In the train again, Mrs. Darling was found again, and the way she had seen her for the first time. It was the morning after the day my mother had told me about her. After the mother talked to the daughter about Mrs. Darling and why she took away everything, the next day the daughter had seen Mrs. Darling there. I had got up late. That is when she had seen her. Coming downstairs, I saw my mother about to see someone out, a woman with a broad back. This Mrs. Darling was a woman with a broad back. There is my daughter, said my mother. She beckoned to me. The woman had picked up the suitcase under. She wore a brown coat and a shapeless hat. Does she live far away? I asked. Seeing the difficulty she had going out of the house with the heavy suitcase, she had very much difficulty in carrying that. So the daughter, out of concern, asked that does she live far away? And at that time she had given the address that in Marconi Street, said my mother, number 46. Remember that. I suppose you understand why she must have asked her to remember that. I had remembered it, but I had waited a long time to go there. Initially, after the liberation, after the freedom, I was absolutely not interested in all that stored stuff, and naturally, I was also rather afraid of it. Afraid of being confronted with things that had belonged to a connection that no longer existed. All those things belonged to the mother and the house in which they lived, and neither the mother nor the house were there now, which are hidden away in the cupboards and boxes and waiting in vain until they were put back in their places again. So again, those things were had been, say, packed and kept in the cupboards, and might be they were waiting in vain for the daughter, which had endured all those years because they were things, and they had waited and had tolerated being in the cupboards, not being utilized, only because they were things. But gradually everything became more normal again. Bread was getting to be a lighter color, that is, after the war. There was a bed you could sleep in unthreatened. Now, after liberty had been attained, say, one could sleep without being threatened. A room with a view, you were more used to glancing at each other. So, the room also had a window through which you can glance at each other, glancing at each day. So, from the window, you can have a look at the day. And one day I noticed I was curious about all the positions that must still be at that address. And one fine day, after the things had relaxed up after the war, after they had got liberty, she was curious, was eager to know about all the possessions, all the things that the mother had given to Mrs. Darling. I wanted to see them, touch them, and remember. After my first visit in vain to Mrs. Darling's house, I decided to try a second time. Now a girl of about 15 opened the door to me. I asked her if her mother was at home. No, she said, my mother is doing an errand. No matter, I said, I'll wait for her. The next time she went, the girl of 15 greeted her, and the mother was not at, Mrs. Darling was not at home. I followed the girl along the passage. She went into the house, an old fashioned iron Hanukkah candle holder hung next to a mirror. We never used it because it was much more cumbersome than a single candlestick. Okay, so that is one thing that she saw. She recollected that this is something that was in my house once upon a time. Won't you sit down? Asked the girl. She held open the door of the living room, and I went inside past her. I stopped horrified. I was in a room I knew and did not know. So, all the things in the room were the things that she knew very well. But this was the room that she was entering for the first time. So, I was in a room I knew and did not know. I found myself in the midst of things I did want to see again. So all the things in the room were the things that she wanted to see and the things that belonged to her mother, but which oppressed me in the strange atmosphere. But as these things were in a strange atmosphere, I was oppressed. Or because of the tasteless way everything was arranged. Now, the things in that house were arranged in a very bad way, and that's why she was oppressed on looking at those things. Because of the ugly furniture or the muggy smell that hung there, I don't know why I felt so oppressed, I cannot explain. But I scarcely dared to look around. The girl moved a chair. I sat down and stared at the woolen tablecloth. I rubbed it. My fingers grew warm with rubbing. I followed the lines of the pattern. Somewhere on the edge there should be a burn mark that had never been repaired. That woolen tablecloth also was the one that they used, and in that there was one burn mark, and that had not been repaired, and it was still there. My mother will be back soon, said the girl. I have already made tea for her. Will you have a cup? Thank you. I looked up. The girl put cups on the tea table. She had a broad back, just like her mother. She poured tea from a white pot. All it had was a gold border on the lid. Now there was gold border in that white pot only on the lid. I remembered. She opened a box and took some spoons out. That's a nice box. I heard my own voice. It was a strange voice, as though each sound was different in this room. Oh, you know about them? She had turned round and brought me my tea. She laughed. My mother says it is antique. We have got lots more. She pointed round the room. See for yourself that so many things we have, and all these things are antique. Now, those antique things really belong to the narrator. I had no need to follow her hand. I knew which thing she meant. I just looked at the still life over the tea table. As a child, I had always fancied the apple on the pate plate. We use it for everything, she said. Once we even ate off the plates hanging there on the wall. I wanted to so much, but it wasn't anything special. I had found the burn mark on the tablecloth. The girl looked questioningly at me. Yes, I said. You get so used to touching all these lovely things in the house, you hardly look at them anymore. She was touching that thing that is the burn mark on the woolen tablecloth that you don't even look at it. You only notice when something is missing or because you have lent it, for example. In that case, you miss something. Again, I heard the unnatural sound of my voice and I went on. I remember my mother once asked me if I would help her polish the silver. It was a very long time ago, and I was probably bored that day, or perhaps at home because I was ill. As she had never asked me before, I asked her which silver she meant, and she replied, surprised, that it was the spoons, forks, and knives, of course. And that was the strange thing. I didn't know the cutlery we ate off every day was silver. The girl laughed again. I bet you don't know it is either. This is also made of silver. I looked intently at her. What we ate with? She asked. Well, do you know? She hesitated. She walked to the sideboard and wanted to open a drawer. I look, it's in here. I jumped up. I was forgetting the time. I must catch my train. She had her hands on the drawer. Don't you want to wait for my mother? No, I must go. I walked to the door. The girl pulled the drawer open. I can find my own way. As I walked down the passage, I heard a jingling of spoons and forks. At the corner of the road, I looked up at the nameplate. Marconi Street, it said. I had been at number 46. The address was correct. But now I didn't want to remember it anymore. I wouldn't go back there because the objects that are linked to my in your memory with the familiar life of former times instantly lose their value served from when savored from there. You see them again in strange surroundings. And what should I have done with them in the small rented room where the shreds of blackout paper still hang along cutlery fitted in the narrow table drawer? I resolved to forget the address. Of all the things I had to forget, that would be the easiest. Many things I had to forget, but this address was something that was the easiest to forget. Now go through the question answers and write down the meanings in the fair book.